The Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI spent the better part of his reign absolutely obsessed with producing a male heir. The universe, having a finely tuned sense of irony, gave him Maria Theresa instead. So, unable to change biology, he decided to change international law. He drafted the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, a document designed to ensure his daughter could inherit his ridiculously complex collection of territories. For nearly 2 decades, he went on a diplomatic spending spree, trading favors, land, and money to get every major European power to sign this piece of paper. It was a masterclass in preemptive diplomacy, securing a solemn, legally binding promise from people who viewed treaties as temporary suggestions. Everyone from France to Prussia signed, effectively saying, "We would never dream of taking advantage of a succession crisis. That would be rude." On October 20, 1740, Charles VI eats a dish of death-cap mushrooms and promptly dies. You cannot make this stuff up. His death triggered a continent-wide case of selective amnesia regarding the Pragmatic Sanction. The first to act was the newly crowned king of Prussia, Frederick II. This guy was an aspiring philosopher and flute player who also happened to believe that a well-trained army was the best tool for international negotiation. He looked at the Austrian province of Silesia, rich in resources and poorly defended, and decided his dusty, centuries-old claim to it suddenly looked very compelling. Meanwhile, Charles Albert of Bavaria also announced that actually he should be the Holy Roman Emperor, based on a marriage from the 1500s. It was going to be a messy few years. Frederick didn't bother with tedious formalities like declaring war. In December 1740, he just marched 30,000 Prussian soldiers right into Silesia. His public reasoning was incredible. He claimed he was invading to protect Maria Theresa's inheritance from other, less scrupulous rulers. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a burglar breaking into your house to protect your television from other burglars. He then sent a diplomat to Vienna offering Maria Theresa a deal. Just give him Silesia and he'd be her best friend forever. He would even vote for her husband, Francis Stephen, to become Holy Roman Emperor. This was less a diplomatic offer and more a demand with a powdered wig on top. Maria Theresa was not amused. Everyone expected the 23-year-old Maria Theresa, pregnant with her 4th child, to just roll over. They had severely miscalculated. While her ministers panicked, she went to work. Her armies were in shambles, her treasury was empty, but she had one ace up her sleeve: Hungary. The Hungarians had a long history of being difficult subjects, but she appealed to them directly. In a famously dramatic speech to the Hungarian Diet in Pressburg, she held up her infant son, Joseph, and made a passionate plea for their support. Legend says she was weeping, which might be true, but it was also a brilliant political performance. The Hungarian nobles, moved, supposedly, drew their swords and roared, "Our lives and blood for our queen," which was a much better response than her Viennese advisors, who mostly suggested surrendering. Frederick's land grab opened the floodgates. France, still bitter about its rivalry with the Habsburgs, decided this was the perfect time to dismember Austria for good. They joined with Bavaria to support Charles Albert's imperial ambitions. Spain jumped in too, hoping to claw back some territory in Italy. Suddenly, Maria Theresa was facing a super coalition of enemies from all sides. A French-Bavarian army even captured Prague in 1741 and had Charles Albert crowned King of Bohemia. For a moment, it looked like the Habsburg Empire was about to be sold for parts. The war was no longer about Silesia, it was a free-for-all to see who could carve the biggest piece out of the Austrian inheritance. It was Europe's most violent estate sale. Across the Channel, Great Britain watched all this with growing concern. Not because they cared deeply about the rights of archduchesses, but because they had one non-negotiable foreign policy rule: mess with France. A powerful France dominating the continent was London's worst nightmare. So King George II, who was also the Elector of Hanover in Germany, decided to help Maria Theresa. It was a purely pragmatic decision. They sent money, lots of it, and assembled an army of British, Hanoverian, and Hessian troops, quaintly named the Pragmatic Army. Their job was to keep the French busy in Germany so the Austrians could focus on kicking Frederick out of Silesia. This turned a German succession dispute into the opening act of another global Anglo-French rivalry. As usual, the involvement of the Pragmatic Army led to one of the war's more peculiar moments, the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. King George II decided to personally lead his troops, making him the last reigning British monarch to ever do so. The battle itself was a mess. The French had the British and their allies trapped, but then a French duke seeking personal glory disobeyed orders and attacked. George II's horse bolted, carrying him towards the enemy lines, so he dismounted and led the infantry on foot, reportedly saying he knew his legs wouldn't run away. The Allies somehow managed to win, mostly thanks to French incompetence. It was a chaotic, accidental victory that proved courage is great, but a blunder by your enemy is even better. Because European powers couldn't keep their conflicts to themselves, this Austrian squabble inevitably went global. In North America, it was known as King George's War. The French and British colonies, along with their respective Native American allies, started fighting each other. The most notable event was New England colonists capturing the massive French fortress of Louisbourg, a feat that shocked military professionals back in Europe. Meanwhile, in India, the British and French East India Companies decided this was a great excuse to fight for commercial dominance. The war in Europe was the main event, but its franchise spin-offs in America and Asia were already setting the stage for even bigger future conflicts. Humans have always been excellent at multitasking their wars. Back in Europe, Frederick the Great was proving to be a uniquely terrible ally. He fought for his own interests and no one else's. After securing Silesia, he signed a peace treaty with Maria Theresa in 1742 and just left the war. He abandoned his French allies without a second thought. But then, a couple of years later, when it looked like Austria was getting too strong and might try to take Silesia back, he jumped right back in. He launched a surprise invasion of Bohemia in 1744, forcing the Austrians to pull their armies away from the French front. Frederick's strategy was simple: keep Austria and France bleeding each other dry while he cemented his control over his prize. It was cynical, treacherous, and brilliantly effective. While the Pragmatic Army kept some French forces occupied, the main French effort was in the Low Countries. This led to the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745, one of the most famous battles of the age. It was a massive, bloody affair where the French, led by Marshal de Saxe, narrowly defeated a coalition of British, Dutch, and Hanoverian troops. The battle is famous for a supposed exchange where a British officer invited the French to fire first, a level of politeness rarely seen in warfare. The French won the day, but at a huge cost. They captured territory, but the victory didn't knock Britain or Austria out of the war. It just prolonged the bleeding on all sides, proving that sometimes the worst thing you can do is win an incredibly expensive battle that doesn't actually change anything. Oh, and there was a whole other war happening in Italy this entire time. Because of course there was. This front was a complicated mess of Austrians, Spanish, and troops from Piedmont, Sardinia, all fighting over Italian duchies. Spain's main goal was to secure a kingdom for Philip V's younger son, Don Philip. It was less about grand strategy and more about finding jobs for the royal children. The fighting surged back and forth across northern Italy, with cities like Milan and Genoa changing hands. The whole affair was a drain on Austrian resources that could have been used against Prussia. It was a perfect example of how 18th century wars weren't neat, tidy conflicts, but sprawling, multi-front nightmares that served a dozen different dynastic ambitions at once. After 8 years of this, everyone was exhausted. More importantly, everyone was broke. Britain was spending a fortune subsidizing its allies, France was staring at the abyss of state bankruptcy, and Austria was barely holding it together. Frederick had Silesia, but his country was drained. The war had reached the point of diminishing returns. No one had achieved their grand objectives. The Habsburgs were not dismembered. France had not achieved continental dominance. Britain had not permanently crippled France. They were all just tired. Peace negotiations began not out of a desire for harmony, but because the accountants were screaming louder than the generals. The most powerful force in 18th century politics, as always, was the looming threat of an empty treasury. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. The result was a spectacular anticlimax. With one major exception, almost everything went back to the way it was before the war. This is known as status quo ante bellum. The French gave back the Austrian Netherlands. The British gave back the fortress of Louisbourg to the French, much to the fury of the American colonists who captured it. The Spanish prince got a duchy in Italy, and Maria Theresa's right to rule was finally, officially, recognized by everyone. The one big change? Frederick got to keep Silesia. After hundreds of thousands of deaths and 8 years of war, the only lasting result was that Prussia was now a major European power, and Maria Theresa was absolutely furious about it. So what was the point? A war started to prevent a woman from inheriting ended with that same woman firmly on the throne, where she would rule effectively for another 32 years. She reformed her army, centralized her state, and became one of the most significant rulers of her era. The entire conflict was a dress rehearsal. Maria Theresa never forgave Frederick for stealing Silesia, and this unresolved issue would directly lead to the much larger, much bloodier 7 Years' War just a few years later. The War of the Austrian Succession was less a conclusion and more the end of the first episode in a 2-part special about a very angry queen and a very ambitious king. It proves that nothing sets the stage for the next war quite like a peace treaty that satisfies no one. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!